This unit is the second part of Unit 1 of U.S. History 1, and it will cover more of the colonial period. Just so you know, this PowerPoint presentation and this lecture that I'm giving on this PowerPoint presentation is not going to follow directly with the textbook. The textbook is going to cover basically all of the same information, but maybe organized a little differently. But the great thing about that is that one supplements the other. If you read the textbook and then watched the presentation, the PowerPoint presentation, and read it, you would get a very broad idea of what's happening, and vice versa if you watch this presentation and then read the textbook. So please do both. It'd be very beneficial when it comes to testing, uh, because both are testable. As we saw earlier in the previous presentation, multiple colonies established themselves uh, in the New World, in what is in the Americas. And the interesting thing about it is they were all really different, especially different by region. You had your uh, southern region, your middle colony region, and your New England region. And each region in English America developed a characteristic culture, something that was unique to them, depending on the shape or strength of the families that comprised the population. In New England, for example, families were stable. In the Chesapeake, they were fragile. Chesapeake being the Virginia area and into the southern colonies. After 1660, a trend toward cultural convergence began. That means they started to, the different areas and regions began to share similarities. They had a convergence of their cultures. Uh, and this happened primarily because the crown, or uh, the British monarchy, imposed a set of uniform commercial regulations on the colonies, meaning they started to pass laws that applied equally to the different colonies and to the different regions of the colonies and different regions of their empire. Here's a map that shows the original 13 colonies, and it's always good to know. I mean, when you're thinking about and reading about history, you always kind of have in your mind geographically what you're looking at. So I always try to remember it from south to north, uh, and I just, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, um, Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and then Maine. Of course, Vermont will become a state immediately after the Revolution is over, but at this point it's not a colony. It's generally a disputed area between New Hampshire and New York. So let's take a look at the different communities that established themselves in the colonies during this time. We'll first look at the New England colonies. Most New England settlers arrived as a nuclear family. That means that they came already as a married couple with children. Okay, they were just attempting to basically reestablish their English life in the new colony, since the name New England. They didn't want to change anything. And well, this is one thing we always have to remember too, and never forget this, especially the earliest settlers, but even all the way up into the middle of the 1700s. All these settlers were loyal British subjects. They had no desires to separate themselves from Great Britain, because at this time Great Britain was the greatest empire in the world, and they loved being part of the British Empire. They loved the protection of the British Empire, the benefits of being part of the British Empire. All they were looking for the most part, in the New World wasn't escape from the British Empire, it was opportunity. Religious opportunity and economic opportunity. But as I said, most arrived as a nuclear family. Strong paternal authority, meaning the father ruled the house. As I mentioned, they were attempting to preserve English ways. The sex ratio was relatively even, same number of men and women, and of course with children, that relatively an equal amount of children being raised, which made for a stable society. Everybody could find a mate. Everybody could find a spouse. And they lived longer because of their nuclear family, because of the stability, and also, maybe most importantly, because of the weather of New England, the cold weather. Um, New England settlers early on in the colonial period had a much healthier and longer life than those farther south. Now, one of the interesting things about the New England is that they believed in something called a commonwealth of families, meaning that you were bonded to your community. You had certain responsibilities and certain loyalties and to your community, to the commonwealth, to the greater good. Uh, and so New England towns were a collection of interrelated households. Most of it revolved around the church, because New England was the initial settlements of New England were the Puritan settlers and the Pilgrims, and so religion was maybe the most important part of the family life in New England. So everybody's lives revolved around the church. There wasn't a lot of individualism during this time period. You acted the way you were supposed to act. You didn't want to be different. You didn't want to stand out. Uh, you didn't want to flaunt any wealth that you had. That was frowned upon. That was not considered proper manners. You were humble, and you presented yourself that way. Church membership was strongly associated to the family, and you were judged basically as a family and as a patriarch, as a father, on your family's religious fortitude. Uh, and the family was the primary educational institution. And of course, early on, what you taught your children to read in New England during this period was the Bible. That was uh, how children learned to read. Now, in New England, women played an important role. Uh, their role was basically a wife and a mother, and not much else. They had no real legal status. Uh, they didn't have social status. They stayed home and raised the children. Although some were influential, they didn't show it publicly. Women did not have power in the church. They were considered to be submissive. Uh, Marriages, though, and this was kind of a new thing, relatively new thing for societies at this time. Marriages were generally based on mutual love. Prior to marriages based on mutual love, and you may ask yourself, well, what other marriage is there? Well, a lot of them were marriages of convenience. You know, if you were a young lady and if you hadn't been married off by the time you were 18 or 19 years old, then you would end up being a spinster, and so your parents oftentimes would arrange marriages for you, find a suitable man or suitable spouse for you that could take care of you and support you, and they would not have to have the financial burden of their daughters anymore. And so marriages began at this time, though, to be based on love. People married people because they loved them, not because of convenience. There was no political or legal equality for women during this time. They couldn't vote. They couldn't run for office. They had no real status except as the property of their husbands. But they played an important role in promoting and providing stability for the family and the community. They ran the house. The husband oftentimes worked and was the face of the family in church and in business and out in public. But inside the house, most of the time, the women ruled the roost. There's also a social hierarchy in New England, meaning there was social status, not as wide of social status and range of social status as there was in England and even today. Uh, Early on, there were very few rich immigrants from England. Most of them, as I mentioned before, were middle class. They were professionals. They weren't poor, but they weren't wealthy. And their Puritan ethic prevented them, even if they had wealth, their Puritan sensibilities prevented them from flaunting that wealth. Uh, the elite families were generally the most religious families. The prominent pious families or religious families emerged as the quote unquote gentry, okay, as the elites that were looked up to and deferred to. Uh, of course, well, these gentry, these pious families may have had money. You wouldn't know it because you didn't flaunt it. But later, as the commercial ventures take hold and people become very wealthy, uh, they begin to flaunt that wealth and they turn away from their Puritan traditions of being modest, and they just begin to flaunt the wealth. And of course, then those people, the wealthy, that have the most things and the most money, become those who emerge as the elites or the gentry of the society. But all in all, most of the people in New England were middle class farmers. They may have had professions, but they also had a farm, and there were relatively few poor people, because most people that settled in New England came over as a nuclear family. Uh, if you didn't have a family or you didn't have a job, you probably were kind of persuaded to go elsewhere. So there were relatively few poor people, and that also led to the less of a rigid social hierarchy. Now the Chesapeake area or the southern area was very different. You're talking about the Virginia colony, North Carolina, even parts of Maryland. It was very different. Um, Almost everything about it was different. There was a high death rate, and it was a difficult place to live, and so over time, the society itself evolved differently. Most of the people that came over early on were male, young, and indentured servants. Okay, and they were single. And basically, somebody who is an indentured servant is somebody who comes over and for the cost of being of their ship of their travel over to the New World, they paid in their labor for a set number of years. So let's say I'm a poor young, you know, British young man, and I want to get to the New World to make my fortune or to start over or to run away from the police or whatever. I would cut a deal with somebody, maybe that already was already in and established in the New World, and say, look, you pay my passage over to Virginia, and I will work for you for 7 years. You teach me a trade, you house me, I will work for you, and then after 7 years, you set me free to start my own life. That's basically indentured servitude. But what happened was many of those early settlers, those young males who came over, died after something called seasoning, quote unquote seasoning, which is basically seasoning is your adaptation to the diseases and to the environment of the Chesapeake area, because it's very hot there. It's humid. There's a lot of bugs, tropical types of diseases, and so many of them died, and they didn't survive longer than maybe a year or two. Uh, and oftentimes they left widows and orphans because maybe they came over and they met their wife, um, and they had a child, and then all of a sudden they died. Also, the ratio of men and women was much different than in New England. There were many, many more men than women. Uh, for a couple of reasons. As I said, most of them came over. Most of the men came over to New England not as nuclear families, but as workers, as indentured servants, and then of course many of them uh, uh, died and left widows, which and that gave women bargaining power. If there's a few women and a lot of men, the women could be very choosy as to who their husband could be because there was a scarcity of women. So they had bargaining power over the men, over who would they would choose to be their spouse. Uh, while in New England, the mainly commercial ventures, there were professionals, lawyers, and then shipping was important. In Virginia specifically, and early on especially, uh, tobacco equated to wealth. Okay, that was where the money was at, and it was of course a plantation economy. It's labor intensive. You have to have a lot of land and a lot of workers, and so early on they would bring over indentured servants. Okay, they would bring over indentured servants to fill this labor need. But the problem was that many of these indentured servants, they were from Great Britain, so they looked like the general population. But also during this time too, they were bringing over Africans, and while they were many of the Africans, especially in the early 1600s, these African workers also served under indentured servitude rules, meaning that they would work for a certain period of time and then be freed. But over time, the British indentured servants, they would escape after, being over here just a few years or a few months, because they could blend into society. They could escape Virginia and just go up into New England and just start over. And they didn't stand out. Nobody knew that they were an escaped indentured servant. But and that created a shortage of labor. And so the labor that stayed and that they were able to keep was the African labor, who could not blend into society. And as the need for labor grew, they transitioned slowly, but generally as the slave population, as the African population grew, stricter and stricter rules regarding their freedom came about. And over time, basically, the indentured servitude system converted to a slavery system, to where you didn't just work as an indentured servant for somebody for a short period of time. You were basically owned as a slave by your master. And of course, this plantation society, this idea that all the land needs to be, or the huge majority needs to be used for crops, leads to a rural society. There are no cities because these plantations could be, huge, and the plantations themselves would be sizes of cities. But it's all crop, and there's not very many people, just the slaves and the plantation owner's family. Whereas in New England there weren't plantations. The ground and the soil was not conducive to that type of crop, so cities were formed. People lived closer together in smaller plots of land. So that leads to a much different type of society being formed, rural versus urban. Urban society in New England, rural society in the Chesapeake. Nuclear family society in New England, much more disproportionate ratio between men and women in the Chesapeake society. And of course, basically while there were slaves in New England, a labor society, a paid labor society in New England versus a slave labor society in the Chesapeake. So two very different societies developing. Now, the system of slavery in the early colonies was established to replace the Native Americans as labor. They couldn't control them. They were unable to make them do what they wanted to, because they were familiar with the territory. They would run away. They had friends they could run to. Uh, they spoke the languages of those around them, those other natives, and they were able to escape. Whereas Africans were not able to do that. They didn't have that advantage. They did not know the languages of the people when they arrived, and they did not know the territories, and they could not hide. So they were the perfect replacement for the Native Americans that they couldn't control. Most African slaves initially came to the Caribbean. They came to the Caribbean, the islands, and it was from there that they were sold up to the mainland. Now, this may sound weird, but for many it was better to be on the mainland. It was a relief to be sold onto the mainland and get out of the Caribbean, because it was the horror stories that you hear about slavery in America. It's oftentimes it was 10 times worse in the Caribbean and in the islands, because it was hotter, there were more diseases, and there were more slaves, so they were expendable, and they were treated much worse in many cases than they were on the mainland. But as population of slaves increase, as I mentioned before, legal restrictions increase, and then maybe the most pivotal moment is that the condition of slavery became inherited, and it followed through the mother. So the condition of the mother became the condition of the child. So if the mother was a slave, the children were slaves, and of course this made sense for the masters, because oftentimes the masters or the members of the master's family were the fathers of the children of the slave women. and it would be if the condition of the child followed the condition of the father, then many of the children would have to be freed. So your condition was dictated by what your mother's condition was when you were born. So if your mother was a slave when you were born, then you were a slave. Um, Africans made up a majority of the southern population very early on. They Slaves outnumbered white people by in some states like South Carolina by a huge amount. Uh, while the North did have slaves, there were fewer slaves in the North, and they were not necessarily what you might call plantation slaves. They're more like butlers and domestic workers, carpenters, maids, uh, and they worked in closer proximity with the white population. In the South, some interacted with whites, others, for the most part, did not. Uh, but what happened in this deep South, especially, as these huge plantations with these huge numbers of slaves living together, uh, they began to form their own culture. Okay, they began to form their own norms, and it was as a way to survive and as a way to comfort each other. They protected each other, they helped each other, and they developed just a common culture um, that uh, became the crutch on which helped them survive. Much of it was revolved around religion as well. Uh, there were free blacks, more in the North, of course, than in the South, and those ones in the North, most of them worked as laborers or mariners. It was a very choice job if you get on work on a ship, and you could travel the world and see other parts of the world. So there were free blacks at the time, and many of them were relatively successful uh, working. This map shows the Atlantic slave trade in Africa, where the slaves, most of them came from, and then the arrows show where most of them went initially. Okay, now, as you can see, as I mentioned before, very few went directly from Africa to British North America, to what is now America. Most went into the Caribbean. 42% went into the Caribbean, into what they called the West Indies at the time. But basically, it's the Caribbean islands uh, and then many more went into South America, specifically Brazil. Now, once they were in the Caribbean, many times they were transferred over time up into North America, but the initial stop, for the most part, was for most American slaves was the West Indies or the Caribbean. Now, during this time, while the slave population was growing and the plantation life was increasing, and tobacco and other crops became very important, you also see the colonies rise as a commercial empire. Um, you know, empires, countries don't create empires just for their own benefit. Not for their own benefit. They want to make a profit from their empires. They want to make a profit from their colonies. And of course, Great Britain was no different than any other empire. They wanted to make a profit from the colonies. Now, in the earliest years, with all of the wars going on, the Civil War, wars in Great Britain, and just being so far away, that the colonies were left alone for the first few decades of their existence. Okay, especially during the wars and during the when Cromwell was in charge of Great Britain, the colonies did whatever they wanted to. They traded with whoever they wanted to. They set their own rules. They established their own political norms. They, their own legislative assemblies, town hall meetings up in New England, the legislatures, the House of Burgesses in the South. Uh, but then things began to slowly change after the restoration of the Stuarts in the 1660s. They began to be getting competition for trade from the Dutch, the Spain, and the Portuguese. And the colonies, they had been trading with the Dutch, the Spain, and the Portuguese in the early 1600s. And of course, they got great products, and they could also, bargain against the different suppliers and get the best deal. And Great Britain saw this as a problem because they believed in an economic system that is called mercantilism. Now, mercantilism is this idea, and it's an important idea of the time because it dictated a lot as to what happened. Mercantilism is this idea that there's only a finite amount of wealth in the world. There's only so much gold, so much silver, so much money. Okay, and of course, all nations, just like all people, want to become richer. And so the only way to become, if a nation, because there's a finite amount of wealth, if a nation becomes richer, that means by definition there's a finite amount of wealth. Another nation must become poorer. It's a zero-sum game. If there's only a set amount of money and I'm getting more, that means other people have less. Okay? So the idea is to make sure that you bring in more money to your country in your empire than you send out. So the idea is that you must have a favorable trade balance. Okay, it means you must always sell more to other countries than you bring in. And to do that, you must develop your domestic industries. You must have the ability to create finished goods to send out to sell that other people don't make. So the whole point is to make more stuff in your country, sell it to other countries, and you bring in the gold. And you save that gold because they're having to continuously give it to you because you have the domestic industry. Uh, when you buy things from other nations, you are sending money out, and you're becoming poor in the minds of the mercantilists. And so, in order to ensure that this happened and that um, money was staying within the empire, the British passed something called the Navigation Act of 1660. And it basically, in a nutshell, told the colonies over in the Americas that they could really only trade with England. They could sell other stuff to different nations, but they could not buy things from the Dutch or from Spain or from Portuguese or from the French because that violates the principles of mercantilism. You're sending money out instead of bringing money in. And also, the the colonies, according to the Mercantilist Navigation Acts of 1660, had to sell raw materials to Great Britain first in order to fuel their domestic industries. So if the shipbuilding industry is a priority in England at the time, which it was, well, the lumber, the quality lumber from the colonies, had to be sold first and foremost to England to keep it in the empire, so that England would not have to buy the lumber, the quality lumber, from other nations, violating the mercantilism. Uh, Now, of course, the New England merchants and the colonists did not like this at all. They wanted to buy from whoever they wanted to buy from. And, you know, they had been buying from the Dutch and the Spanish and the Portuguese for decades. And so now all of a sudden they didn't like this idea of being told who to buy from. And so they really basically ignored it. Okay, they ignored the navigation acts. They would smuggle stuff in from different nations, and the British kind of knew it. They knew what was happening, but there was no way that they could enforce it. They called it salutary neglect. They just kind of nodded and saluted and said, "Well, we know you're breaking the law, but there's nothing we can do about it," because the coastal the coast of the colonies was so long, running from Georgia all the way up through Maine, that there was no way that that the British Navy could patrol that entire coastline to prevent the smuggling. So they just kind of let it go, and it went that way for many, many years, for really upwards of 100 years after the Navigation Acts were passed. And it's going to be a problem because they ignored them and they let the colonists kind of do what they want to and ignore the laws. That's going to create a real problem that's going to come back to bite them later. So these navigation acts, which were put in place to try to, you know, tell the colonists what to do and who to trade with, were basically ignored by the colonists, and the British knew it, and they really did nothing about it. Now, as we have been talking about it, it seems like it's relatively peaceful in the colonies. That there's not a whole lot of whole lot of factions or friction going on, but that is not necessarily the truth. There were many revolts and many, not just Indian revolts, but revolts amongst the colonists over unequal treatment and other reasons. And a couple we're going to talk about here is first, Civil War in Virginia, Bacon's Rebellion. Uh, Nathaniel Bacon was just a farmer that lived out into the in the backwoods, not a coastal person, but in the backwoods, and he was resentful that Governor William Berkeley, who was a royal governor appointed by Great Britain, uh, was not allowing the backcountry people to protect themselves and fight the Indians on their own. Bacon wanted to establish his own militia to prevent Indian raids and to further expand and gather territory deeper into Virginia. And and they were being constantly attacked and constantly having to fight the Indians. Well, Berkeley wouldn't do anything about it, mainly because Berkeley was profiting from trade with the Indians, and he didn't want to disrupt that profit. So Bacon formed a rebellion and formed a group, and he basically revolted against the government of Berkeley, and Berkeley had to run off and escape to England, and Bacon uh, took over Virginia for a short period of time. Of course, he got sick and died quickly after that. I mean, who knows how long potentially his leadership could have lasted, because he was a very powerful leader and a very strong leader. But he died of an illness not long after taking control. And of course, Berkeley came back, and all of those that supported Bacon, or especially all of his fellow leaders, were all executed by Berkeley. But you start seeing divisions. It's almost like the elites of the coastal areas, the old money of the coastal areas, versus many of the new immigrants who couldn't afford to settle on the coastal areas, and had to settle in the back country, deeper into the woods, deeper into the colonies, to eke out a living. And they weren't treated equally. They were seen, especially because many of them came from different parts of Europe. Many immigrants now at this point were coming from Ireland and Scotland, and they were seen as inferior to the initial settlers who were mainly from England. Then you have the Glorious Revolution in the Bay Colony being Massachusetts. Uh, um, Sir Edmund Andros ousted in 1689 when William and Mary replaced James II. Remember that I told you about that Protestant Revolution, where the Protestants ousted the Catholic James II, and there was great joy in the colonies. And Sir Edmund Andros, who had been supported by James II, the Protestant majority rose up against what they saw as Andros's tyrannical rule, and basically he barely escaped being, tarred and feathered and strung up and killed. And there was a lot of riots in the streets, and but it was basically a revolution once the William and Mary duo took over. Then you had other types of problems like the Salem witch trials, which I'm sure you're somewhat familiar with, where in some of these Puritan communities of Massachusetts, specifically in Salem, uh, there was a lot of paranoia about young women specifically becoming possessed by the devil and becoming witches, and there's many theories as to why this happened, and why the reaction to it by the establishment, by the the religious leaders of Salem, led to basically burning young women at the stake, drowning them, uh, because they feared that they were witches, and that they feared that they were threatening their religious society. And it was really an interesting period where so many social, economic, and religious factors came into play that led to people taking the most extreme action against their neighbors. Uh, Many argue that much of it was just old feuds that were being settled by people. Others say there were societal factors, the changing of the economies, the changing of the norms of the time. But anyway, the Salem witch trials, young women mainly were put on trial, and most of them found guilty and put to death. Uh, then you have the Glorious Revolution in New York and Maryland. Once again, post James II, after William and Mary took the throne. A German immigrant named Jacob Leisler takes control over New York. He's Protestant, of course, and he persecutes and rounds up all the Catholics he can find and persecutes them and kills some of them. Uh, he is a later arrested and executed for this, but I guess the upshot of all this and the point of all this is that there's all these different groups of people coming in, and there's all these different religious pressures. There's all these different societal pressures. There's all these different economic pressures that are not only bonding the colonists together, but also splitting them and dividing them. And and this, of course, is going to be a tradition that lasts up to this day. That we're such a diverse society that we have to find ways to work out our differences. And of course, every now and then, violence becomes that way. And back then, it was one of the ways in which they saw as their only way to work out the differences.